All right, we're resuming, moving rapidly along the highway of learning here in chapter 5. We're going to resume with slide number 37 concerning the United Nations. And we're talking about how the United Nations enforces law and order, how they enforce national law. The enforcement of ICJ decisions, the International Court of Justice, is basically contained in Chapter 14, Article 94 within the United Nations. And it gives law enforcement authority to the Security Council. The Security Council can enforce judgments of the ICJ if it deems it necessary. And thus it's subject to all kinds of political debate. And so there's generally three different types of security. There's collective security, and there's peacekeeping, and there's peacemaking. And so the most violent and form is collective security, when this actually yields or results in actual armed combat among nations. Under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, authority is granted to the Security Council to take both non-military and military measures to reduce and eliminate threats to international peace and security. And this particular Chapter 7 authority has been used very rarely. In fact, it's only been used twice. It's been used in the 1950s to send United Nations troops over to the Korean Peninsula in the Korean War. And it was also initiated in 1990 and 1991 in the first Gulf War to send UN troops into Kuwait to dislodge Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. And so it's a very rare occurrence that occurs. If you move on to slide number 38, you can see the various vetoes that have been passed by the Security Council with regards to security measures, various different measures through the years. And what is interesting is if you look at the first segment there, the number of vetoes, you see that the USSR has had 106 vetoes from the years 1946 to 1965. But then if you look at the United States, from 1965 to 2014, the United States has had, 76, 84 or so vetoes from the 60s on. And what that reflects is a balance of power shift. In other words, after World War II, the balance of power in the world generally tilted toward the United States' favor. So the United States was pressuring the UN for various initiatives, and of course Russia was totally against the United States, being their enemy, so they used the veto quite a bit. From the 1960s on, the balance of power has shifted. Again, many countries became communist in the 40s and 50s, so that by the 60s, there were more nations represented in the UN that had sympathies toward the United Nations. So you see a lot more American vetoes than Russian vetoes. Again, when you look at the vetoes historically, it generally reflects the balance of power. If you look at slide number 39, it talks about the two additional aspects of UN law and order. Again, collective security is the most vigorous, it's the most aggressive. It generally involves armies that are actually shooting at each other. The lesser of the three, the one that generally does not involve active shooting, but does perhaps involve UN troops, is what's called peacekeeping. And what that does is it involves the UN basically going into a situation where there already is peace, and they're trying to maintain the peace. In other words, not trying to achieve peace. The nations have already finished fighting. There's some sort of truce. There's some sort of ceasefire. And the UN, by sending troops in there, kind of communicates to both nations and both armies, don't start something, we're going to step in. The other aspect, the third aspect of UN enforcement is called peacekeeping. And so it's called second generation peacekeeping or peacemaking. And this involves the UN sending troops into conflicts where nations currently are fighting, and with the intention that as the UN troops are sent in there, they can perhaps bring both nations to a truce, to a ceasefire, to some sort of a negotiating table, and they can kind of, literally make peace. There's all kinds of mixed records of success. Some of the failures have been noteworthy. Probably the most noteworthy is what happened in Rwanda, where the UN found out that there was all kinds of internal fighting within Rwanda, and literally hundreds of thousands of people were being killed. And the United Nations took about 2 months to make a decision to send peacemaking troops in there to stop it. By the time they got in there, 800,000 people had been killed, and by and large, they did not make much of a difference at all. In fact, it was quite frankly a pretty big failure. You can see other examples on slide number 40. In 1995, in the summer of 1995, 600 Dutch UN peacekeeping forces were sent into Bosnia, and they literally stood down as Serbian troops shelled a UN safe haven. And as the 600 UN peacekeeping forces were calling in for reinforcements and air support, it was largely ignored by the UN, and so they basically stood by when about 7,000 Muslim men were killed. Another example that was more positive is in Sierra Leone, where they went in and brokered a ceasefire. So again, it's kind of a sketchy record. If you look at slide number 41, you can kind of see a really good matrix that shows kind of the difference between peace enforcement, which is collective security, peacekeeping, which is first generation peacekeeping, and then peacemaking, which is second generation peacekeeping. Again, collective security involves the most vigorous aspect of the peacekeeping, whereas the actual first generation peacekeeping is the least aggressive, and peacemaking is the second most aggressive form. If you look at the slide on page 43, you can see an example of the UN peacekeeping missions as of July 2010. And you can look at it there, and you can see that when we talk about UN peacekeeping, it's not just a sterile academic exercise of some form of theory or some form of law that never goes into effect. You can see in 2010 there were all kinds of areas around the world where UN peacekeeping was involved. Moving on here on slide 44, it talks about the importance of reforming the United Nations. One of the key structural problems that's argued is that the UN organ with coercive power, the Security Council, is stymied by the veto. Again, remember, the way it works is that when the Security Council of 15 members makes a decision, if only one of the PERM 5 members vetoes it, it can shut it down. Again, there's different arguments here. I would submit to you that statement, the key structural problem is that the UN with coercive power basically has no coercive authority because of the veto. I would submit to you that's a liberal argument. Okay, in other words, liberals tend to favor the international community, so they're seeing the veto as a problem. Whereas realists would say, no, the veto is actually a good thing. One of the reasons why the victorious powers at the end of World War II set up the veto power is they were trying to protect national sovereignty. Again, if the Security Council is making a decision that is in violation of American national sovereignty, the quickest way you can preserve it is just veto the Security Council initiative. So again, in my estimation, that statement within your textbook tilts towards more of a liberal argument. But again, it goes both ways. Realists would say, no, the veto is a good thing. But by and large, what that veto tends to do is it tends to prevent a lot of UN initiatives from occurring. If you think human nature is basically good, you're going to have a problem with that. If you're a realist and you think human nature is basically sinful or flawed, then you're going to say, no, veto is actually a good thing. We don't want very large global governance. It's more important to have individual nations to have a say-so. Again, one of the interesting footnotes in history is that technically the Korean War in the 1950s should have never happened. But what happened is in the 1950s, the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council. They most likely, most assuredly, would have vetoed the initiative to commit UN troops into to Korea, but because they weren't involved, it got passed. So kind of an interesting footnote. Skipping on here as far as some other issues that I want to talk about. Another reform idea, if you go to slide number 47, one other reform idea is to shift the balance of power within the Security Council from being Eurocentric to being more representative of the world as a whole. If you think it through, well, 4 of the 5 PERM 5 members were either European or connected very closely to Europe. Again, the United States, Anglo-American relations was very strong and has been for 100 plus years. The only non-European country in the PERM 5 is China. So one argument is, if the Security Council started from scratch today, you'd remove France, you'd remove Great Britain because they're no longer the power brokers that they used to be, and you perhaps bring in another country like Japan or India because of their large economies. In other words, you re-weight the Security Council based on dominating countries today. And you can take a look at that, the different models there. I'm not going to belabor these points, but if you look at slides 48 and 49, it talks about, shifting gears and bringing other nations in to balance the power. Another concern, a reform concern that's been voiced is, okay, the UN's got a standing army. They can engage in collective security, but it takes about 3 to 6 months to assemble a fighting force. In other words, it takes a long time, and by that time, by the time you get that army together, obviously, perhaps there's a genocide that's already occurred and you haven't done anything. So the argument is to perhaps create a multinational standby high readiness brigade. I'm not even going to voice the acronym there. But in other words, this idea that you've got 5,000 troops at the ready at any given moment that can get involved, okay? Probably the problem of that is many states are reluctant to relinquish sovereign control over a decision to put their soldiers' lives in danger. In other words, if America committed, let's just say, 1,000 troops to that, technically those 1,000 American troops are subordinate to the international community and not subordinate to American generals. And so another problem with that is that perhaps it could run afoul of domestic constitutional procedures. But these are some ideas that have been voiced to reform the UN. So that is pretty much it for Chapter 5. And so I'm going to try to post this tonight, and I'll work on some of the lecture for Chapter 7, which is quite lengthy, later on in the week. So hang in there, stay safe, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.